Why might one be financially poor or considered financially destitute when it comes to matters of getting what you call decent housing? If not for oneself, then for one's family, if one has one. Or adequate medical care also. Or to save money for old age, for oneself and loved ones. Here are some thoughts I have. First, one might have a religious perspective that says there is an afterlife and a big reward for certain people if one stays to a certain viewpoint or does certain things or doesn't do other things. And so poverty financially doesn't mean nearly as much to some individuals thus. Or perhaps someone doesn't mind financial poverty too much if they are zoned out on some chemical substance for a long-term basis. But thirdly, maybe some people are, quote, financially poor or destitute, even if you could argue rich in spirit, because they are unable to grasp one or more key truths that would make it more advantageous to make money in the first place. Maybe, for instance, they are unable to do what Christian scriptures call winnowing people, or sorting people out into certain categories, especially those advantageous to you and those not. Psychologists might refer to this as our desire to sort friend or foe, and very quickly. Now, maybe we grew up believing that everybody is basically the same. That may have come sometimes from a religious upbringing that said, for instance, from the Christian perspective, that we are all sinners and fall short of the glory of God. It never saying, perhaps on rare occasion exceptionally, that there are big sinners, you might say, and little sinners. For the Bible doesn't say there was Mr. Hitler sinner or Mr. Stalin sinner versus Noah sinner or Esau sinner or Joseph sinner. So to grow up thinking everybody is basically the same would make it very hard to have a concept of friend or foe to even try to apply to people in general. We would just simply, quote, homogenize everybody as either all good or all bad, or maybe something just nebulous. When we throw up our hands and say, I don't know who anybody is, including myself. Then there are those who say that they would rather not assess somebody if it's going to impact them negatively, the assessor, that is. In other words, they make a decision along the way, unconsciously, not to use hate words, blame words, or what Dr. David D. Burns, a psychiatrist who wrote Feeling Good, the new mood therapy, around 1980, said, when he said, don't use labels on people. In other words, I would call disrespectful terminology, and I could go into that as I have in the past, what I mean by that. You might say, use words that are much more neutral, descriptive of the act itself, rather than words attacking character. Character in this case meaning anything saying that they didn't do the best they could. Unfortunately, I believe most all words regarding people have one degree or another of this notion that you could have done better somehow if you'd simply tried harder. Hence, in the show series by Diane Sawyer on ABC News around 2010, Children of the Mountains, talking about Appalachian people and their poverty financially sometimes, it being the accusation of laziness and indulgence in drugs, that there were too many instances of trash on the front lawn, such as washing machines broken down or cars. And a social worker out there is saying contrary-wise that there aren't the resources to pick this up, the trash. So some saying that words can hurt. Words can be very injurious and you can't take them back once you say something hurtful. And so some people would rather say nothing and even think nothing. And biblical scriptures, for instance, of the Christian tradition often say, don't judge lest you be judged. But in my mind now, this needing a lot of clarification, and in my mind in the last few years too, seeing that this likely involves use of blame words to silence people up, not a neutral evaluation. That would not probably be called judging. Judging would be to use terminology, I guess, that would render the person you are assessing someone despicable, so to speak. The terminology being everything as to whether one is, quote, being judgeful or assessing. For we assess colors we want to put on a wall if someone is going to paint them, say, as discussed by an interior decorator we hire. But we would not use those color swatch words if the words conveyed disrespect about people who paint them, who paint the colors. Hence, why some people don't want to use blameful words and then find themselves nonplussed, non-able to assess in general the veritable wolves in sheep's clothing, or friend and foe. And without that capacity, they might find it very hard to understand people in general, who to spend more time with, who to spend less time with, and motives, and what makes people tick, and how they get money, whether they want money, what money serves a purpose for, and so on. And they're rendered rather handcuffed in many a way in life, for both survival long term and getting certain needs met in the shorter term, also for happiness for themselves and their family, if they have a family once again. And you might say this often playing out in terms of what you call financial poverty, in my mind only in specific areas more than others, like adequate housing, especially if you want to live in an urban area, or when it comes to medical care or maybe legal care. For in these areas, it seems to me there is not enough of the top quality to go around. And so money plays a crucial role here. I'd say perhaps one final but crucial idea too. There's a man, Chris Do, D-O, in California, who has a YouTube channel, The Futur, F-U-T-U-R, and does much online work and lecturing, motivational speaking, what have you. He said one time something that impacted me a lot. He said when he learned to overcome his belief that he was an imposter, this concept commonly called imposter syndrome, then he said his business took off like a rocket. Well, it seems to me, as I've thought about it, maybe we feel sometimes we are an imposter because we don't know how to sort out who some other real imposters are, because we are unable to sort wheat from chaff comments and sort and categorize people in general. Hence the term that so-and-so is gullible and believes whatever they're told. Maybe that is in part because they're frail, say, or of a certain gender and lack empowerment, and so cave in and believe whatever they're told, including that their ideas are worthless and some others have great merit. By the way, this being a key concept in Dr. David Schwartz's book around 1960, The Magic of Thinking Big, when he talked of how people, well, I would say some people, put down their own ideas and capacities and put others up. And Dr. David Viscott, a psychiatrist who wrote, amongst other books, one on risk-taking, mentioned that some people trust the wrong people. If you could say anyone is totally trustworthy, I would say even. So if we believe anything we're told, or thus we believe too anyone who says that our ideas are worthless compared to theirs for whatever reasons, I think that could render us rather handcuffed again in the acting department of life as to getting off the dime and putting our ideas in action with, yes, some risk-taking involved, or simply fewer doubts about anything in life. This can be tied, I believe, in part to the concept of this imposter syndrome we may have sometimes, some of us, and this needing to be examined and largely overcome before we can be more effective in life, in that involving in part finances, if that is our desire. Noting, I would say, though, those living in rural areas or deep areas have much less need in general of finances to a higher degree than those in urban areas. And the same too, if one has no family, less money being needed for adequate education and adequate good neighbor situations as to a safe neighborhood and so on, for one's children once again, and to a lesser extent the spouse, if the spouse is a female. This may thus be why some people wish to use displays of wealth to communicate, in part, that they are savvy about life, that they are not naive, that they are able to see parts of reality adequately enough to make more than poverty level income, as per finances, that is. I would note, though, finally, with a little bit of humor or not, that a month or two ago, a man with a sign outside of a box store asking for financial assistance, some derogatorily calling this panhandling or begging, I would say, told me his viewpoint of certain individuals coming into the box store with very high-end automobiles compared to his clunker truck. His viewpoint being that many of these vehicles were bought on credit. And I would say then perhaps more of a matter of being used to display a certain concept that might not otherwise be displayable without having bought this on credit. Maybe they wish to convey a certain sense of not being naive then, in the sense of having enough savvy to get that vehicle. Or maybe it conveys power also. The power of money one has theoretically as conveyed by the vehicle one has, the money to get it. One last thought. Grant Cardone, who has some $2 billion or more in holdings and once spent time in his early 20s struggling much with drugs, call it drug addiction, said he was going to reform his image by getting a jet. And he wrote a check, $50 million, to a company and got a jet the next week. Also, Michael Santos, who spent some 27 years in prison, starting around age 20 for cocaine selling, said that when he got out, he was going to reform his image by getting at least $1 million within a couple years. So, having money or high-end objects, noting that Grant Cardone said if it wasn't a jet he was going to get, it would be a castle. These tend to convey certain concepts to people, in part that one has theoretically a clue about life as to certain things, as to be able to even get that money. Some thoughts here to consider as I've been pondering why we may be misevaluated even if we don't have a high-end automobile or what some would call a mansion that we live in, or dress, as some would say, in power suit manner, power dressing. Some may misinterpret this as a lack of savvy to even get that in the first place. But I would say it has more than one component here. And finally, one last comment. Maybe more than a few people are able to get a considerable degree of money compared to some others because they found a way to do it legally. One man, I was told, had a side hustle, for instance, of going to a state up north, buying a boatload, so to speak, of marijuana legally and bringing it down to the state I live in and selling it on the side, shall we say. And there being a number of other ways to make money legally or through legal loopholes, or to even evade certain tax payments with legal loopholes too, if one has the proper, shall we say, advice to minimize the risk of it all. And so we might sometimes call this white-collar criminalism, but it seems in my mind that refers much more to the so-called white-collar committing crimes they haven't been caught for, rather than doing things that are actually legal and yet negatively impactful to some others. There is even, of course, the reality it's easier by far to make money if one is good-looking than not so. All things I think I've pondered over the last few years, and I offer up for consideration. Maybe some of these are very commonly known and others might just be reinforcement or jog some thinking.